The Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as one of the bloodiest and most brutal urban battles in human history, a hellish confrontation that claimed over 2 million lives and marked the turning point of World War II. But what many don't realize is that while tanks crushed through rubble-strewn streets and soldiers fought room by room in the ruins below, an equally savage and decisive battle raged in the skies above. Hundreds of aircraft clashed in desperate dogfights over the burning city, as pilots from both the Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force, the Vojenno-Vostockie Sily, or VVS, engaged in brutal aerial combat that would determine not just the fate of Stalingrad, but the entire war on the Eastern Front. This often overlooked aerial conflict showcased extraordinary acts of courage, revolutionary tactics, and the transformation of the Soviet Air Force from a battered force into a formidable adversary. So let us uncover the hidden dimensions of one of history's most significant battles and reveal why the skies over Stalingrad were just as deadly and decisive as the hellish ground below. By the spring of 1942, the Third Reich stood at the height of its power. Despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in a single campaign, the Wehrmacht had captured vast territories. Yet beneath this veneer of invincibility, a critical weakness festered: oil. Hitler knew that without the oil fields of the Caucasus, Germany's war machine would eventually grind to a halt. The summer offensive of 1942, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, was designed to secure these vital oil fields. However, Hitler's notorious tendency to meddle in military operations soon manifested. In July, convinced that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse, the Führer made a fateful decision. He split his forces, sending Army Group South A toward the Caucasus, while Army Group South B, including General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, would turn eastward toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a sprawling industrial center of 500,000 inhabitants, stretching 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River. The city featured massive factories in the north, the Barikady Ordnance Works, the Red October steel plant, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, converted to produce T-34 tanks. Yet in June 1942, Stalingrad had been no more than a name on a map. Within months, it would become the site of the largest and bloodiest battle in human history. The offensive was to be spearheaded from the air by Luftflotte 4, commanded by Generaloberst Wolfram von Richthofen. Von Richthofen was an experienced and aggressive commander who understood the critical importance of air power in modern warfare. Under his command were some of the Luftwaffe's most capable units, including Flieger Corps 8 under General Martin Fiebig. Von Richthofen saw the capture of Stalingrad as the key to German success on the entire Eastern Front. He requested additional transport groups and ordered maximum efficiency in operations. His activities bore fruit as the Luftwaffe constantly lifted ammunition, provisions, and fuel to the front. The Soviet Air Force, meanwhile, was in dire straits. The VVS had been swept aside by the Luftwaffe's initial onslaught. Between July 25th and August 31st, VVS bases in the immediate area lost 201 aircraft. And despite meager reinforcements, the Soviet Air Force was left with just 192 serviceable aircraft, only 57 of which were fighters. The technological gap was stark, and Soviet pilots, many with minimal training, faced an experienced and confident enemy. One Soviet intelligence report from this period vividly captured the desperate situation. "The enemy is again attacking us heavily with his air force." Another noted grimly, "The movement of enemy tanks takes place under the cover of his aircraft." The Luftwaffe's dominance seemed absolute. The German drive accelerated throughout July and early August. By August 23rd, German panzers had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. It was on this date that the battle truly began, and it would rage for the next 163 days. On the afternoon of August 23, 1942, at precisely 3:18 p.m., the Luftwaffe unleashed hell upon Stalingrad. What followed was one of the most concentrated and devastating aerial bombardments on the Eastern Front. Units of von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 attacked the city in waves throughout the afternoon and into the night. During that single day, Luftflotte 4 flew approximately 1,600 sorties and dropped 1,000 tons of bombs on the city, effectively destroying it. Only 3 German aircraft were lost. The devastation was apocalyptic. Buildings crumbled under the blast effects of high explosives, while extensive use of incendiaries torched factories, schools, and houses. Wooden structures were incinerated completely, leaving only their brick chimneys standing like tombstones in a vast cemetery of ash and rubble. Torrents of burning oil and petrol from ruptured storage tanks flowed into the Volga until the river itself appeared to be on fire. The sky turned black with smoke, and the air became thick with the acrid smell of burning buildings and flesh. Contemporary estimates suggested between 40,000 and 70,000 civilians were killed, though conservative estimates place the death toll at around 4,000. Even this lower figure represents an immense tragedy, concentrated into just a few hours of bombing. For the following 5 days, the bombing continued block by block. The few Soviet fighters that managed to get airborne were overwhelmed by the swarms of German aircraft. The Luftwaffe had achieved complete air superiority over Stalingrad, and they exploited it ruthlessly. At least 90% of Stalingrad's housing stock was obliterated during the first week of bombing. The city had been transformed into a moonscape of craters, rubble, and twisted metal, an urban hell.
Despite the catastrophic losses and the Luftwaffe's overwhelming superiority, the Soviet Air Force was not destroyed. While battered and bloodied, the VVS began a remarkable transformation that would ultimately turn the tide of the air war over Stalingrad. The coordination of Soviet air operations was managed by Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, a capable and innovative commander. In the Stalingrad sector, the Soviet 8th and 16th Air Armies bore the brunt of the fighting. The 8th Air Army was commanded by Major General Timofey Kryukin, while General Sergei Rudenko led the 16th Air Army. Recognizing that they were outmatched in both pilot experience and aircraft quality, Soviet commanders began implementing new tactics and training programs. Soviet pilots increasingly abandoned rigid formations in favor of the more flexible German Schwarm, the Finger 4 formation that allowed for better mutual support. More VVS aircraft were equipped with radio sets, and a radar and radio control network established behind the front line proved adept at guiding Soviet pilots to their targets. Marshal Novikov also formed elite units such as the 9th Guards Fighter Regiment to engender a new aggressive spirit in the Soviet Air Force. These Guards units were composed of the best pilots and received priority for equipment. Perhaps most importantly, the Soviet aviation industry was beginning to hit its stride. Aircraft factories produced 25,436 aircraft in 1942 alone. This industrial base would prove to be the Soviet Union's trump card. Even if individual pilots and aircraft were lost at alarming rates, replacements kept flowing to the front. The VVS also benefited from increasing deliveries of Lend-Lease aircraft, with machines like the P-39 Cobra proving popular and effective in Soviet hands. As German forces entered Stalingrad itself on September 13th, the battle devolved into a savage urban meat grinder. Soviet forces were compressed into an ever-narrowing strip along the Volga's western bank, at times holding a position less than a mile deep, yet they refused to break. The Luftwaffe continued to fly massive numbers of sorties. From September 5th to 12th, Luftflotte 4 conducted 7,507 sorties, an average of 938 per day. On October 14th alone, the Luftwaffe launched 1,250 sorties against Soviet positions. Yet despite this overwhelming air support, German ground forces could not eliminate the final Soviet foothold. For the VVS, this period was one of desperate resistance and gradual improvement. Soviet pilots flew from bases on the eastern side of the Volga, taking off from primitive airfields. They faced not only the Luftwaffe, but also brutal weather conditions and chronic shortages. Many Soviet pilots were barely trained, having received only minimal instruction before being thrust into combat. The average Soviet fighter pilot had perhaps 30 hours of flight time before entering combat, compared to 240 hours for Luftwaffe pilots. Young Soviet pilots were shot down in droves by experienced German aces. One Soviet pilot recalled, "As we approached the city, I could see the black smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. The sky was filled with aircraft, ours and theirs. I barely had time to think before tracers were flashing past my cockpit. My wingman disappeared, and I never saw him again." Despite these losses, the VVS kept flying. Soviet commanders adopted a philosophy of overwhelming numbers. Wave after wave of Soviet aircraft attacked German positions, accepting heavy losses, but gradually wearing down the Luftwaffe. Soviet pilots also began to exhibit desperate courage, ramming German bombers when ammunition ran out, in what was known as Taran, a suicidal but effective tactic. By late September, the strain on the Luftwaffe was beginning to show. By September 20th, Luftflotte 4, reduced to just 129 airworthy aircraft, found itself increasingly on the defensive. The VVS, meanwhile, was growing stronger. Among the most remarkable stories of the air war over Stalingrad are those of the Soviet Union's female fighter pilots, particularly Lydia Litviak, who became the world's first female fighter ace. Lydia Vladimirovna Litviak, known as Lilia, was born in Moscow in 1921. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union, she had already trained dozens of pilots as an instructor. Initially rejected for frontline duty because of her gender, Litviak exaggerated her flight hours to gain acceptance into the all-female 586th Fighter Regiment. In September 1942, Litviak was transferred to the 73rd Fighter Regiment flying Yak-1 fighters over Stalingrad. On September 13th, during her very first combat mission over Stalingrad, Litviak proved her mettle by downing a Junkers Ju-88 bomber and a Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter. The Bf-109 was piloted by a veteran German ace, who reportedly refused to believe he had been shot down by a woman until Lilia personally described the dogfight to him. Litviak's combat style was aggressive and fearless. She personalized her Yak-1 by having mechanics paint a large white rose on each side of the fuselage, earning her the nickname the White Rose of Stalingrad. She flew with top Soviet aces and earned a spot in elite free hunter missions, special patrols where experienced pilots were given freedom to seek out enemy aircraft. Also fighting in the skies over Stalingrad were the legendary Night Witches, the 858th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit flying obsolete Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes on night harassment missions. These wooden fabric aircraft were so slow that German fighters often stalled trying to engage them. The women would idle their engines and glide silently over German positions before releasing their bombs, then restart their engines and escape into the darkness. German soldiers gave them the nickname Nachthexen, Night Witches, because the whooshing sound of their gliding aircraft reminded them of a witch's broomstick. The Night Witches flew thousands of sorties over Stalingrad, disrupting German sleep and supply operations. 23 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. While the world's attention focused on the brutal house-to-house fighting in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet commanders were quietly preparing a massive counteroffensive that would change the course of the entire war. Operation Uranus had been in the works since early September. The plan was audacious. Soviet forces would strike at the weakly held flanks of the German salient, manned primarily by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces, and encircle the entire German 6th Army in a massive double envelopment. And then, on November 8th, the Luftwaffe at Stalingrad took a heavy blow. Entire units of Luftflotte 4 were transferred to North Africa in response to Allied landings. Von Richthofen was furious, but his protests were ignored. The Soviet Air Force suddenly found an opportunity to challenge German air superiority. November 19, 1942 dawned with a howling blizzard. At dawn, more than 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and mortars cut loose on the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. An hour later, waves of Soviet infantry broke over the shocked Romanians. The Soviet Air Force launched massive strikes in support of Operation Uranus. The Ilyushin Il-2 Stormovik, the famous flying tank, proved its worth during this offensive. For the first time, Stormoviks were employed in large numbers, with 575 available at the start of the operation. The IL-2 was a revolutionary aircraft. Heavily armored to protect the pilot and engine, it could absorb tremendous punishment. Armed with cannons, machine guns, rockets, and bombs, it specialized in attacking ground targets. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the Stormovik. One Romanian soldier described a Stormovik attack. "We heard them before we saw them, a deep, droning sound. Then they came over the trees, flying so low I could see the pilots' faces. The ground erupted in explosions and machine gun fire. Men were torn apart, trucks exploded, and horses screamed in terror. It was hell itself descending from the sky." On November 20th, the southern pincer was launched. Soviet tanks poured through the breaches. The Luftwaffe attempted to respond, but it was hampered by bad weather, fuel shortages, and the sheer scale of the Soviet offensive. On November 23rd, the Soviet 24th Tank Corps captured the critical airfield at Tatsinsky in a daring raid. German aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip. As Soviet tanks burst onto the airfield, German aircraft desperately attempted to take off in the chaos. Aircraft collided on the runway, tanks fired into parked planes, and explosions rippled across the field. Over 70 aircraft were destroyed. The loss of Tatsinsky was a crippling blow to the airlift effort. Inside the pocket, conditions were equally grim. The airfields were under constant Soviet artillery fire and air attack. Wounded soldiers, desperate to escape, mobbed every aircraft. A German transport pilot described the nightmare. "Flying into the pocket was like flying into hell. We would take off before dawn, flying through storms and past Soviet fighters. The flak was intense. Landing at Potomnik, you had to dodge shell craters and wrecked aircraft. The wounded would surge forward, begging to be taken out. We could only take a few. The rest would watch with dead eyes as we took off again." The airlift never came close to meeting the Sixth Army's needs. During the 7 weeks of the operation, the Luftwaffe managed to fly in an average of only 94 tons per day, less than 1/8 of the bare minimum required. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 488 aircraft during the entire airlift operation. These losses included not just aircraft, but also irreplaceable experienced transport crews. The Soviet fighter pilots racked up impressive scores during this period. The Ilyushin Il-2 Stormovik units also played a crucial role, sweeping over German airfields at low altitude, strafing parked aircraft and support facilities. By early January 1943, the situation inside the pocket had become desperate. German soldiers were starving, freezing, and dying of disease.
On January 10, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to eliminate the Stalingrad pocket. 7 Soviet armies, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power, began systematically crushing the German defenses. The VVS flew massive numbers of sorties in support of the ground offensive. Soviet bombers pounded German positions, while Sturmovik ground attack aircraft provided close support. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a handful of operational aircraft, could offer only token resistance. Inside the pocket, the situation had deteriorated beyond imagination. German soldiers, many suffering from frostbite, starvation, and typhus, could barely hold their weapons. The airfields were overrun by Soviet forces, eliminating any possibility of supply or evacuation. On January 22nd, the last supply flight landed in the pocket. After this date, the Luftwaffe could only make supply drops from the air, often inaccurately. A German soldier's diary entry captures the horror. January 26th. It is now certain that we are going to die. The cold is unbearable, and we have had no food for 3 days. Russian aircraft fly overhead constantly, and we can do nothing but hide in cellars and wait for the end. On January 31st, 1943, the southern pocket surrendered. Field Marshal Paulus was taken into Soviet custody. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days before also surrendering on February 2nd. the battle was over. Of the 250,000 German and Romanian troops encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. Soviet casualties were even higher, with estimates ranging from 750,000 to over 1 million. For the Luftwaffe, Stalingrad represented a catastrophic defeat. The aura of Luftwaffe invincibility was shattered completely. The Soviet Air Force, by contrast, had transformed from a beaten force into a formidable adversary. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a fundamental turning point in the air war over the Eastern Front. The balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. In the months following Stalingrad, the VVS continued to grow in strength. Soviet aircraft production reached staggering levels. In 1943 alone, the Soviet Union produced 34,845 aircraft compared to Germany's 24,807. New Soviet aircraft like the Yak-9 and La-5FN could compete on equal terms with German fighters. The Luftwaffe never recovered from its losses at Stalingrad. The destruction of the transport fleet hampered operations across all theaters. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The lessons learned at Stalingrad influenced air warfare for the remainder of the conflict. The importance of coordination between air and ground forces, the value of dedicated ground attack aircraft, the effectiveness of free hunt fighter tactics, all became standard doctrine. The psychological impact was profound. For the Luftwaffe, the defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the VVS, Stalingrad was vindication. Soviet pilots had proven they could match and defeat the Luftwaffe. Lydia Litviak continued fighting until July 1943, when she was shot down and killed during a dogfight. She was just 21 years old, and her final tally stood at 12 solo victories and 4 shared victories, making her the most successful female fighter pilot in history. She was posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union in 1990. The air battle over Stalingrad was one of the largest and most brutal aerial conflicts of World War II. While it has been overshadowed by the apocalyptic ground battle, the struggle for control of the skies was equally decisive and just as savage. The Luftwaffe entered the battle as a confident, experienced force. German pilots expected another triumph. Instead, they encountered an enemy that refused to break, that absorbed punishment and came back for more, that learned from its mistakes and adapted. The air battle evolved in distinct phases. In August and early September 1942, the Luftwaffe enjoyed almost complete air superiority. The apocalyptic bombing of August 23rd demonstrated the terrible power of unchallenged air power. By October and November, the balance had begun to shift. The launch of Operation Uranus marked the turning point. By February 1943, the transformation was complete. The air battle teaches us enduring lessons, that numbers matter when intelligently employed, that adaptation is crucial, that morale and determination can compensate for material disadvantages, that strategic mistakes can be fatal, and that air power alone cannot win wars. The pilots who fought in the skies over Stalingrad, German and Soviet, male and female, experienced aces and green recruits, demonstrated extraordinary courage. Many paid the ultimate price. Today, the air battle remains largely forgotten, overshadowed by the epic ground battle. Yet it was just as important, just as brutal, and just as decisive. The sky above Stalingrad was truly an inferno, where hundreds of aircraft clashed in desperate combat that helped determine the fate of nations. The ruins of Stalingrad have long since been rebuilt, but the memory of those who fought and died in the skies above should not be forgotten. They were warriors who faced death daily, who pushed themselves to the very limits, and who helped write one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of aerial warfare. The verdict of the sky was clear. The age of Luftwaffe supremacy had ended, and a new era had begun.
From the ashes of Stalingrad, the Soviet Air Force had risen, battered, bloodied, but ultimately victorious. The sky above the Volga had witnessed the transformation of the VVS from victim to victor, a transformation that would shape the remainder of the war and the post-war world. As we remember the Battle of Stalingrad, let us not forget to look up, to remember those who fought in the frozen skies, who dodged flak and tracers, who watched their comrades fall in flames, and who carried on despite the terror. Their story deserves to be told, their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, and their courage deserves to be honored. The hell above Stalingrad was just as real, just as deadly, and just as significant.